must work untiringly so that our children are obliged to learn the truth. Because it is only through knowledge that we can safely protect them. Failing this, the next tragedy may be that of your daughter, or your son, or yours, or yours, or yours.
Dang, dude, calm down. It's just a little weed. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. And in this episode, we are going to go way back, not the earliest film I've done on this program. If you want to see the earliest film, I did a discussion with a colleague of mine on a 19-teens silent film, but we're going to go back to 1938. And this film has gone by a lot of names. It was originally called Tell Your Children, but since then, it's been called Reefer Madness. Now, you may be familiar with Reefer Madness because it's been around for a long time. And so it's made its way into the cinematic overt, the cultural zeitgeist, and it has lasted for a long time. I mean, marijuana and cannabis have been topics of late as well. But there were also remakes. There was a musical that was made, I think, about 20 years ago or something like that. But I'm going to focus on the original movie. And I've been wanting to do this for a while. But the reason why I'm doing this movie, and this is going to be a solo episode, so one of my more essay-related episodes that I've been sort of making for the last couple of years now when I do a solo episode. So sit back, relax, and enjoy my take on this movie and some of the things that I've researched about it, some of the things that I've read about it, and, the history of marijuana in the United States, and as well as the psychological portrayal of this movie. So let's get into it because the history of this is wild. From the start, let's just go out here and say that this is a 100% propaganda film, okay? As was the sort of way you did things back in this time. There was a lot of need for using this new medium. Of course, talkies had only been around for about 10 years now. So it's just like, yes, let's use this medium to make a point, right? Make a point, do a public service rather than just making art. Well, I mean, to be honest, even though this is a propaganda film through and through, it is still in some ways somebody's version of art. Of course, it is and I'll read to you what the official synopsis is from IMDb. It is a cautionary tale that features a fictionalized take on marijuana use. A trio of drug dealers lead innocent teenagers to become addicted to, quote, reefer cigarettes by holding wild parties with jazz music. But that's not how it started. So if you want to know more about the history of this movie, you got to start back in 1936. And I'll talk about the plot as I go through the movie, but I do need to talk about this history. So officially, the 1938 release was called Reefer Madness. But in 1936, 1937, or 1938, there was a film that came out of a church group originally produced by George Hurleman in the South. It was first shown in the South, where depending on where it was, it went by different titles. I'll tell you all of the titles it went by, right? So the most common name is Reefer Madness. It was originally titled Tell Your Children, which is the final title card that you see at the end of the movie. But it is also known by The Burning Question, Dope Addict, Doped Youth, and Love Madness. So you can see where, depending on where this was shown, a different name sort of brought the attention for the screeners. So George Hurleman produced this, And it was then purchased by exploitation filmmaker Dwayne Esper, who inserted more salacious shots than were originally included in the original cut, right? So Esper began sending it out to the exploitation circuit, right? At least different for territories under different names. So Tell Your Children was the South. West of Denver, it was called Dope Youth. That was in 1940. In New England, it was called Reefer Madness. And then in the Appalachian, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, it was called The Burning Question, right? And so the only way you could see it was to go to one of these exploitation screenings and engage in that, right? It wasn't until the 1970s that preservation was attempted, right? And to assign copyright status to the production company, right? So George Hurleman was given the original production credit, and then Dwayne Esper was given the further release production credits. It was directed by Louis J. Gasnier or Gasnier. I don't know how you pronounce his last name, if it's the anglicized or whatever. And it was written, the screenplay itself, which is very, very shoddy, was written by Arthur Hurl. It stars Dorothy Short, Kenneth Craig, Lillian Miles, Dave O'Brien, Thelma White, Warren McCullum, and Carlton Young. And I gotta tell you, this and it's barely considered a feature-length film because it's only 68 minutes long. And that's a generous runtime. It's more or less like 65 minutes long. But I'll tell you what, this is wild. It had about a budget of $100,000 in 1936 dollars. So it was about $2.1 million in 2024 dollars. It made about $1.4 million for the 1970 Reefer Madness reissue, which came with a lovely theatrical poster with the phrase "adults only" on it. It's very fun. So it probably made more money than, I guess, this is $1.4 million in 1970 dollars. So I don't know what $1.4 million is in 2024, but it probably made more money than the budget was. So I guess it was successful. You can watch the entire film on Wikipedia. There are two. One is 1 second longer than the other. There are literally two closed caption, or actually one has closed captions, one does not. So if you want to have the captions on there, or you can watch it currently on Paramount. It's running through Showtime. So if you have Paramount Plus, you can watch it through Showtime, but you can watch it for free on Wikipedia, so you might as well do that. And like I said, there have been a ton of adaptations and parodies. So there's a 1976 Hawkwind song called Reefer Madness. The Screaming Jets, which is an Australian rock band, had a Reefer Madness song on their 1995 self-titled album. The 1992 stage adaptation opened in Chicago. Clips have been used by Motley Crue in their video for Smoke the Sky. It was parodied in Nightmare on Elm Street 4. There was a 1998 stage musical, which was then converted to a 2005 movie musical, which has a lot of stars that you are probably familiar with. I recommend watching this one because not only is it only 20 years old as opposed to almost 100 years old, but it is great. It stars folks like Alan Cumming, Kristen Bell, Christian Campbell, and Anna Gasteyer in the same roles that you see in the movie. And I think that's probably the best adaptation, which is an adaptation of an adaptation because of the stage play. There's a lot to talk about with this film.
Oh, here. If you want a good smoke, try one of these. If you're afraid. That's better. That's more like it. I know you like that. Really, you will. And just take a puff of it.
Let me give you a brief synopsis of the plot. There are a couple of sets. Again, low budget. The story is bookended, and we're going to talk about this when we get to the psych of it all, but the story is bookended by a character by the name of Dr. Alfred Carroll, and he is talking at a PTA meeting. But it's interesting. So the plot seems to suggest that he is the high school principal at this PTA meeting. And so if you're not familiar, parent-teacher association meeting, right? Yeah, so there are adults, only adults in this audience. There are no children there, no high schoolers again. And so he is talking to these parents and these teachers. So I guess he's the principal, but he's a doctor, right? So he has some sort of gravitas, and he's referred to it as such in the script. And in the beginning, like I said, this is bracketing, bookending sequences. So in the beginning, he's talking about this scourge of marijuana, right? This evil thing, dope, that's coming to high schoolers and causing all of these kinds of things. It's very interesting. Before he even starts talking, before you get a title card that tells you exactly what marijuana does to people. So it says that marijuana is a drug, a violent narcotic, which of course it is not, is an unspeakable scourge, right? And so it says, at first, its first effects are sudden, violent, uncontrollable laughter. Then come dangerous hallucination. Space expands. Time slows down, almost stands still. Fixed ideas come next, conjuring up monstrous extravagances, followed by emotional disturbances, the total inability to direct thoughts, the loss of all power to resist physical emotions, talking about sex, leading finally to acts of shocking violence, ending often in incurable insanity. In picturing its soul-destroying effects, no attempt was made to equivocate. So this is like the setup for the whole story. So Dr. Carroll is telling these parents about this one such incident that happened in another place. Then it brings us to our story.
Be stopped. You and all other school parent groups about the country, and you must stand united on this and stamp out this frightful assassin of our youth. You can do it by bringing about compulsory education on the subject of narcotics in general, the dread marijuana in particular. That is the purpose of this meeting, ladies and gentlemen, to lay the foundation for a nationwide campaign by you to demand by law such compulsory education. Because it is only through enlightenment that this scourge can be wiped out. Out of the traffic in these drugs, a lawlessness that we can scarcely estimate has grown and is now flourishing. It exists in almost every city and hamlet in the country. It might be interesting and important for you to know some of the methods used in bringing these drugs into the country, and the work of the forces of law and order, which are daily combating the traffic, always at the risk of life by their agents. This ceaseless fight against the drug traffic is directed by the Department of Narcotics, Washington. I've received a letter of vital importance from a member of the Narcotics Bureau. I'm going to read this letter to you. My dear Dr. Carroll, the suppression of the use of marijuana and of the forces lurking behind it are the most important jobs this department is now engaged in. At the outset of this letter, there is one vital fact I would like to submit. There is a powerful agency. I speak of the school parent associations of this country, which can be invaluable in stamping out this scourge. Their help, their eternal vigilance, could be the deciding factor in our fight against it. The weed marijuana is grown in every state in the Union. Recently, in the city of Brooklyn, New York, a field of marijuana was found behind a tenement court. The weed was here being cultivated, regularly stripped and dried and sold in schools and at government army posts in and around New York. The dried leaves and berries are ground up and made into cigarettes by a simple hand machine. The deadly narcotic is thus quickly and easily prepared for its market. The sale of marijuana is even more difficult to detect and halt than the traffic in drugs such as opium, morphine, and heroin. They are hidden in fake jewelry cases, in the heels of shoes, women's shoes especially, because the drugs can be secreted in false heels. Hollowed shaving brushes are another medium. Books with false centers are often used. Watch cases are convenient hiding places. The value of drugs thus seized is enormous. Recently, a huge supply of heroin was taken. It was concealed in an apparently harmless shipment of 35 barrels of olive oil. The deadly drug was burned in the incinerator of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And more vicious, more deadly, even than these soul-destroying drugs, is the menace of marijuana. No doubt many of you do not believe that these things do happen, but they cannot happen to you. You may also believe that the facts have been exaggerated. Let me tell you of something that happened right here in our own city. You probably read about it in the papers. However, I'll give you the real facts behind the case. There was an apartment near one of our high schools. It was run by a woman known as May Coleman.
I'll tell that plot here in just a second. At the end of the movie, we come back to Dr. Carroll, who then starts to direct his attention directly to the parents, but more importantly, in a breaking the fourth wall moment, says to the camera, pointing to random parents, but really pointing to the camera, the next tragedy may be that of your daughter, or your son, or yours, or yours, or yours, as the words "tell your children" appear on the screen. And that's the clip that I used in the opening stinger for the episode, right? It's just like, whoa, bro, calm down, man. Calm down. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. So those are the two bookends of the movie. The plot itself is from the perspective of a couple of unmarried people who are essentially drug dealers, and they run a party den in their home, and they sell drugs to teens, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, etc., right? Because that's what their boss wants them to do, right? And this boss is sort of a drug kingpin, although he sits behind a desk in a random room. It's kind of dopey, but yeah, you get the point there. The woman, May, doesn't want to harm kids these ways, but Jack is just following the rules, right? And they recruit the help of a guy named Ralph, who doesn't really care. He is a college dropout. He helps deal to unsuspecting people. He's like, hey, want to come to this party? And we first learn about Ralph from these two other guys on the street who are like, man, that Ralph guy, he's no good. Let's not hang out with that Ralph guy, which I think is like very heavy-handed. That Ralph guy is bad.
Oh, by the way, Ralph, I'm sort of getting a little party Saturday afternoon over at my grandmother's. You know, the place with the swimming pool? Like to come?
Thanks, Eddie. Maybe I will.
I'd sure like to have you.
Okay, I'll probably drop over.
So long, Ralph.
See you later. Hey, Ralph. Hi, kid. Fine, Jack, and you? Oh, great. Where you heading? Oh. Hey, how do you like that? That's the one I was telling you about. Very nice.
I don't know why you want to make such a fuss over that Ralph Wiley.
Oh, he's a swell swimmer. He made the freshman team that year he went to college.
Yeah, and that lets him out. My dad knows his family. None of them are any good. Father and mother just got a divorce from Paris.
Yeah?
You know, Ralph runs around pretty much on his own. He's been in a couple of jams.
Well, I only kind of say hello to him. I don't go around with him.
Well, you better not. He's a little too old for us. That's what my dad said.
They are successful, Ralph and Jack, who is the main drug dealer guy, to lead Bill Harper, who is trying to get smitten with a girl named Mary, straight-laced, doing things by the book, 1930s culture, all that stuff, though is liked by Mary's mother and all of that stuff. And then Mary's brother, Jimmy, to come out and hang out at this party. And lo and behold, they do some reefer. And, and Jimmy's like super into it. And he takes Jack on a car ride and is just driving like crazy and runs over a pedestrian and just keeps running. The guy dies from his injuries. And Jimmy's like, what the hell? Jimmy will forget he was ever in that apartment, right? But they don't have enough details to get Jimmy, so he escapes punishment. Bill, on the other hand, starts getting into it, right? He thinks it's a regular cigarette because this other woman's like, hey, you should do it. Her name is Blanche. And Mary comes to the apartment and is like, hey, what's going on? I'm looking for Bill. I heard that he was here. And, well, Ralph tries to assault Mary, but Bill, under the influence, having awoken from a delirium, is high. And he hallucinates that Mary is willingly offering herself to Ralph, even though it's the exact opposite in reality. And he starts fighting with with Ralph, and Jack then knocks Bill unconscious with the butt of his gun, but the butt of his gun causes him to pull the trigger, like doing a pistol whip, gonna cause you to fire your gun. Oh my God. And the bullet kills Mary. And so they put the gun in Bill's hand, claiming he blacked out and murdered her. And so we have what I found to be quite interesting at the trial. One juror is like, no, I don't like this, which must have been the impetus for 12 Angry Men, honestly, right? Because this one guy's like, no, I don't think he did it. And everyone else is like, let's take a vote. And literally the start of 12 Angry Men, honestly. I thought that was quite good, 15 years later or whatever, when the first 12 Angry Men come out. But Bill is ultimately found guilty. His frame job works. Ralph, however, is just constantly smoking some reefers, right? He's just constantly in it. And he obviously knows that this was partly his problem. So his paranoia, his guilty conscience, he starts going mad. He tells Blanche to play the piano like super fast. And, it's just, he starts laughing she starts laughing. Jack arrives. Ralph immediately recognizes the threat because the boss tells Jack, shoot Ralph. He's a loose end, get rid of him, right? So Jack comes over to shoot Ralph, but Ralph recognizes the threat, beats Jack to death. And then the police come and arrest Ralph, May, and Blanche. May breaks up the whole ring and leads the boss and the other gang members to be arrested and convinces a judge to overturn Bill's conviction because Ralph is the one who did it. Ralph is the one who did it. Ralph now is catatonic, and he is remanded to an asylum for the quote-unquote criminally insane for the rest of his natural life. Quite a wild story. So this film is not just a bad movie, and it's funny. It's kind of like, to me, The Room by Tommy Wiseau, right? And so what I want to talk about in this film is more or less the moral panic and the propaganda of the time, and sort of put this film for you in context. And that context was how it was financed and why it was financed. So, like I said, in about 1936, Tell Your Children, which was the original production by George Herleman, was financed by a church group who wanted to show this possibility, of course, this propaganda, to parents, to teach them about the supposed dangers of cannabis. But why cannabis, right? Why cannabis? Well, the reason is because of the historical context around cannabis. We have to not only understand the 1930s, but we have to go back to a little bit before that, right? So there are a couple of things that I want to talk about that this era sort of represents, right? So in the early 1930s, Prohibition is ended. So from 1918 to 1932, 33, something like that, alcohol, the sale and distribution of alcohol was illegal in the United States. Didn't mean people weren't drinking it, but it meant you had to do some things a little creatively. These bootleggers, as we know, and especially Al Capone being a big bootlegger enterprise done by tax evasion, not by actual prohibition evasion, which is quite hilarious. Of course, people were, the Untouchables movie goes into great detail about how, the United States government was attempting to capture Al Capone for his bootlegging, but ultimately do it through tax evasion purposes, right? IRS and all of that. At the same time, in the late 1930s, going from a constitutional amendment that did not work, that was deeply unpopular, that had to lead to another constitutional amendment, right? So Prohibition was started by a constitutional amendment and was repealed by a constitutional amendment. A different tack was approached, right? Rather than making it a constitutional aspect, just making it federal law, which then required the states to follow suit in how they handled it. What is supremacy clause of the Constitution, whatever that is, saying like federal law supersedes state law, but it was a framework for how to manage these drugs. And this, of course, over the course of about 35-ish years leads to the scheduling system that we have now in the United States. But there was a growing need for regulating, we'll say, and controlling the flow and distribution of these drugs that were not prescription, that were not medically recognized, we'll say. And through the 19-teens and the 1920s, heroin and its derivative and the derivatives of morphine were the aspects that people were fighting. But this new drug, this new marijuana, was linked to the Jim Crow era and Mexican immigration. So not all of the states that bordered Mexico were states yet, right? Our current states of California, Arizona, Mexico, and Texas, not all of them were states yet by the early 1900s, right? But then they started becoming states. And so you had a lot of people who were of Mexican descent or even indigenous Central American descent that were still in the area from the Mexican-American War several decades prior, right? So Mexico was actually where the flow of marijuana started entering the United States, okay? So I'm going to draw from a great graphic novel by Box Brown to sort of lay out this brief history, right? So there are a couple of things to note about the 1930s, and even before that, right? So let's go back to even 1915, right? So the racialized narratives that exist around marijuana are essentially its history, and still sort of pervade the discussion of cannabis today. But they were much higher back then, okay? So because marijuana was ultimately criminalized in 1937, we got to go back to how marijuana entered the United States. It came from the South. It didn't come from anywhere else. There were groups of Asian immigrants. There were groups of European immigrants that started bringing the plant. And maybe you don't know this about cannabis, but it can grow anywhere. Honestly, it is called weed. It's called weed because it grows like one. And so not only did Mexican immigrants from Mexico and the Chicanos that were already there started using the substance as a means to relax, but the church, the Catholic Church, was super against this new thing that they were smoking. It was not approved like tobacco was. And essentially the smell, the way that people behaved on the drug, which is not necessarily different than today, but because strains and things were far less cultivated than they are now, there was quite a bit of difference. It was a relaxer, right? It was something that made people feel good, and so they had to hide these young men, mostly young men, had to hide the substance, which was going by a lot of different names, for using it. And so they would call it like Rosa Maria or Maria Rosa, and then Maria Juana. And there you go. That's how marijuana got its name, from just a bunch of slang some dudes in Mexico using some slang to hide the fact that they were smoking this thing that was not allowed by their church. And they would go to church on Sundays. And then in El Paso in 1915, the newspaper published an article saying that prosperous nations are alcohol friendly, which is hilarious because this was right before Prohibition, and that inferior nations, and because this was in El Paso, they were literally directing this to their immediate neighbor across the Rio Grande. Inferior nations consumed this new cannabis plant. And that's and so that's where it really started in the United States, is in El Paso, making this racialized. The interesting thing about how it then became even more racialized and linked to Jim Crow and other such ideas about inferiority versus and danger and all of these things, is that because Mexican immigrants and Chicanos were working lower skilled, lower wage jobs, as were the Black Americans who were moving out of the South to other locations, were also working lower wage, lower skilled jobs. And so they ended up mixing. And these are laborers on farms, in mines. And eventually, it made its way into the jazz scene. Jazz players, jazz club goers were consuming the product, and it started making its way through brothels, which were, more abundant than they are now, a lot less regulated. Instead of going to Nevada, you could go other places. But then during Prohibition, speakeasies as well. So people were not only smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol in these speakeasies and these bars off the map, but they were also smoking weed. And then jazz eventually made it north to Chicago, and so did weed. And then it started proliferating across the north, the northeast, the Midwest, it was already in the West and the South. And so it made its way all across the United States because it followed jazz, which is quite cool in my mind. That's very cool. The other thing that was happening at this time, not only was that El Paso sensationalist article sort of shot across the bow, but there was this, there were newspaper articles in Chicago, New Orleans, especially New Orleans. And in the late 1920s, the fall of the stock market in the early 1930s and the Great Depression, we're all trying to get Mexican immigrants out of here, right? They were like, get out of Chicago, get out of New Orleans, get out of El Paso, get out of Southern California. You got that weed, get out of here, right? And each of these articles would always claim cannabis was the cause, like the direct link to violence and overdose deaths. And there was an article in the New York Times in July 1927 that was titled, "Mexican Family Goes Insane." And then another Chicago Herald article after that. An Arkansas hashish eater was strolling along the road. He was naked. His clothes were strewn about the highway, tossed in order of removal. While not violent or insane, he did believe he was an elephant. And this all reached a head with one person. One person. His name was Harry Anslinger, and he was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. At first, he was like, heroin's my target for the past 2 decades, 19-teens, 1920s. Heroin, get that off the street, get the illegal flow stamped clothes, because it always comes back to economic policy, because drug companies had special rights to produce it in the United States. That was the whole role of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, is to get illegal heroin off the streets so the drug companies could continue to profit. That's exactly it. And so I would say that in his mind, not only did the racialized and fear-mongering and fear amplification play a role in his decision-making, but he also probably didn't see an economic way out of this. There was no real legitimate cultivator of cannabis anywhere, whether it was in the United States and Mexico or whatever. There was no legitimate, there was no business around this. It was just something that people made in their homes or, in a small plot on their farms. And they kind of just did the drying process and then, rolling it up into cigarettes, right? Joints. And so there was no economic reason for its existence. But then he started hearing reports from white people in places like New Orleans that it was increasing not only the immigrant population, but white people were now doing it. So white people were narking on other white people in heterogeneous places like New Orleans because of the influx of immigration. And he was like, no, white people should not be doing this drug. And so he found a story about a World War I vet who, for all intents and purposes, had PTSD, which was called shell shock at the time, because of the warfare style that was used during that war, mortar shells and just being in constant trenches and all of that stuff, right? All of the explosions weighing on somebody that heavily. So this person was able to access cannabis in Europe, which again was you've heard of the Netherlands. Europe has had weed for a long time, right? And so he found the story of this World War II vet who had started using weed in Europe, right? Who went on to say that he diagnosed himself as an addict. And in the same breath, though, said that the weed was the only thing that helped him with his PTSD. And so Anslinger casually got rid of the "it helped me" and said, I'm going to use the story to say that cannabis is addictive. And he said in a letter, he wrote, "It always ends the same way." This is a quote. "The marijuana den turns to a slaughterhouse. The murderer is always in a complete daze." And he said this before 1936. And that takes us to how this quote made its way into a propaganda film. Not only was this film meant to take that quote from Anslinger, which was dripping with racism, it was meant to scare. It was meant to create fear, especially during the Great Depression when jobs were at a premium, food was scarce, people had no money. So what do? You turn somebody into the enemy and you tell everyone to sic that enemy. And it was because of this one thing. And then in 1937, created a boogeyman with marijuana, with the 1937 Drug Control Act, or whatever it was called.
There is an organized gang distributing the narcotic to students, not only in my school, but all over the city. You government men have got to find some way to put an end to it.
Of course, I agree with you, Dr. Carroll. Let me show you something. In 1930, the records on marijuana in the Washington office of the Narcotics Division scarcely filled a small folder like this. Today, they fill cabinets. All these devoted to marijuana records. Here is an example. A 16-year-old lad apprehended in the act of staging a holdup. 16 years old and a marijuana addict. Here is a most tragic case.
Yes, I remember. Just a young boy. Under the influence of the drug, he killed his entire family with an axe.
Then there is the most vicious type of case. Here, in Michigan, a young girl, 17 years old, a reefer smoker, taken in a raid in the company with 5 young men. Here is a particularly flagrant case.
Yes, I remember. The newspapers made quite a play of it. In West Virginia, wasn't it?
Yes. And there are hundreds of them coming up. New ones every day.
So let's jump to the film, shall we? So, as I said, in Reefer Madness, there's a title scroll. It's kind of a la the way that Star Wars starts, right? With the text scrolling on the screen. So it scrolls up. It's very low budget, right? Somebody made these fancy letters and they filmed it as somebody was pulling it across a static screen, right? And so uncontrollable laughter, into sexual promiscuity, into violent aggression, into psychosis, and then eventually murder, right? Anslinger said, the den turns into the slaughterhouse. The murderer is always in a complete daze. Den turns into the slaughterhouse. 2 deaths in the same apartment. Turns into, the murderer then is in a complete daze. Well, Ralph doesn't do both murders. He does do the second one, and then he's catatonic. There's no space here for moderation. One puff, this is what happens. No variability. Again, as I said, the cultivation of the strains that do different things, broadly, sativa, indica, they do different things today in many people's bodies. And that's the point. They do different things in different bodies. One puff, no variability. That's ridiculous, right? And then, of course, there's no nuance. This is a propaganda film, and it is a fear propaganda film. And it is specifically highlighting moral panic. So the first thing you do for moral panic is to figure out a group or a behavior, either one. In this case, not only was in the real world a group being framed as a threat, but in this movie, it's the behavior being framed as a threat. And more importantly, the threat is to social order, right? So change is inevitable, but you will get a lot of moral panic from the group that wants to keep order. Who is that group? The group that identifies themselves as social conservatives. Conservatism in the world at its basic level is more attuned to the status quo, the current social order, and will fight to keep that social order. Whereas the other political and economic forces of our world are more tuned to progress. Let's make the world better than it used to be, right? So moral panic typically starts from a group towards another group or behavior that threatens that status quo. And this, of course, is a bias in most people's minds that the status quo is better than any kind of change. We don't like change as humans. Change is uncertain, it's scary, it cannot be necessarily predicted. And so what's better? The certainty and the relief that I get from that certainty. Then the framing is exaggerated, right? So the threat is exaggerated way beyond the evidence. And of course, the sensationalist media that I talked about a little while ago, way beyond what any evidence is. There was no evidence at the time, as far as records are concerned, that anybody died from a cannabis overdose. And it's very similar to today's records, where it's probably true that nobody has gotten a cannabis overdose. Now, I'm saying that maybe a little glibly. I haven't looked at the data, but it is not the same as a fentanyl overdose, which is far more common, right? Because it doesn't hit the same brain areas. It doesn't stop you breathing. Marijuana does not stop you from breathing, right? And then you get then the moral panic is you get authorities involved, and that's where Anslinger comes in, right? He's the head of this Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Of course, the narcotics, marijuana is not a narcotic as so defined. A narcotic is a form of neurological depressor. Marijuana doesn't do that in your brain. It does not depress functionality in your brain. It does something different, right? So, in other words, you get the authorities to then exert control through this process. That's what Anslinger was. He convinced Congress to pass a law. It was signed into law by FDR. Despite all of the things that FDR was doing to support people, he was still kind of a racist. And he was absolutely all in on signing this Marijuana Control Act into law and putting it as a charge of the Bureau of Narcotics, which eventually became the DEA. And so in the movie, the moral panic is Dr. Alfred Carroll. He is the moral panicker, right? So not only is he giving the lecture at the front end of the movie and says to the participants there, like, listen to this tale, and then cranks it up to 11. He then, at the end of the movie, says this could happen again and points to people and says, this could be your kid going to a mental institution for the rest of their lives and being in a catatonic state, all because they smoked some weed. And the message is clear in this movie. Of course, the propaganda is clear. Marijuana just doesn't harm individuals. It harms society. It destroys it from within.
He ain't no paper man.
Why, don't you know him? That's hot finger Friday.
Boy, he really swings out hot with a message jive. You want to dance?
Sure.
And I really love the exploration of its effects, right? So the piano scene is, well, there are multiple piano scenes, actually. There's a piano scene at a bar where this guy goes into a closet and is just like sneakily smoking joints, and he's like playing piano really fast. But and so that's one part. And then the other part where Ralph is just fully locked in to his high and it's like, Blanche, play the piano, play it faster, 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 right? Or Jimmy playing the piano, faster, faster, faster. And, obviously this is portraying how they're saying that marijuana not only removes a person's inhibition, but also their lack of rational control, right? To the point of absurdity. Nobody can play piano this fast, right? Or the uncontrollable laughter. There are so many scenes where the actor is asked to do your best uncontrollable laugh, and it is laughable how bad these laughs are. They're forced laughter as opposed to how people actually do laugh when they're high, right? Think of Seth Rogen in Pineapple Express or something like that, and how he goes, right? Or just all of that other stuff is not what you hear in this movie. And then, of course, chalking up to violence and murder. You smoke some weed and you go do some murder. I think that's what every representation of this whole thing has been, right? Smoke some weed, do some murder. I'm going to smoke some reefer and I'm going to do a murder. know about that. Seems kind of like the opposite, right? If you've ever seen Half-Baked, it's truly the exact opposite. Truly the exact opposite. I won't say that cannabis hasn't been linked to violent behavior, because it has. And I'll get to that in just a second. But what are they talking? Like, straight up murder. Now, the first murder is an accident. It's an accident. Jack is not high. He's trying to stop a fight, and he accidentally does a pistol whip murder to another person that wasn't even pistol whipped, by the way. But but Ralph, on the other hand, does do a murder. Now, the first one is framed as a marijuana murder, but the second one is an actual marijuana murder, which calls into question, wait, are people murderous or are they just violent, right? It's hard to know. I think they did not stick the landing on this. And of course, it's exaggerated, right? Directly linking cannabis to violence. Of course, that's not at all the case, because it removes every other aspect of homicidal behavior, which is personality, context, environment, all of that, right?
Come on, darling. Everything will be over soon. Do you want me to play something for you?
Yeah, that's it. Play something.
All right. Come on. Sit down. Honey, give me a smoke, will you?
Master. Master! Play faster. Master. Play faster. Faster.
For this next segment, let's talk about what the film gets so wrong. And the first one is just what I mentioned, cannabis and violence. Cannabis is not strongly linked to violent aggression. Now, in 2020, Miller and colleagues published a report where they examined 14 cases of violence that had been linked to marijuana use. However, I do want to note that these cases, all 14, had pre-existing mental health issues, such as paranoia and anxiety. And these were likely the precursors to the violence. And marijuana was mostly an amplification and made these things unbearable. So yes, cannabis has been linked to increases in paranoia thoughts and anxiety. That's THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Now, CBD, cannabidiol, is sort of like the anti-THC molecule. It's also found in strains of cannabis. And CBD is not as regulated as delta-9 THC is, or even delta-8. Or actually, delta-8's not regulated like delta-9 is either. And so you can get CBD products in places where recreational or medical use of THC is not found. And so there is no distinction here about what cannabis was consumed in these 14 cases as well, and how much CBD. So if you get a 1-to-1 strain or a gummy or some sort of edible or something like that, the high is not going to be as extreme as if you were just to get ones with THC in them. And CBD does seem to have anxiety reduction effects. Now, the Miller et al. Paper does say at the end that it was just a case review and not scientific research, so none of it should be taken as causal. And in 2021, a paper by Raffier and Kalla was a meta-analysis that found any links between violence or violent aggression and cannabis use strictly correlational. And in fact, if anything, alcohol use is far more reliably associated with violence and impulsivity. And it's interesting, though I wouldn't say you could go as far as the scroll about the effects of marijuana in this movie, I would say that alcohol's behavioral profile was mapped onto marijuana for this movie, because alcohol as a neurological depressant does reduce somebody's inhibition, does reduce their rational control, does make some people more belligerent than they are when they are sober. So it seems to me that alcohol was the actual problem, but because alcohol was an industry that exists economically, and of course in 1932 or in 33 or whatever it was, the Prohibition era was repealed, right? That in the mid-1930s, there needed to be a new boogeyman because we can't castigate alcohol. Everyone loves it. It makes us feel good. What about this other thing? Oh, yeah, black and brown people are using it. Let's go ahead and make that the new boogeyman, right? White people aren't using this. Oh, and heaven forbid they do. Now, Ralph at the end of the movie is shown to be catatonic, okay, or suffering from some sort of psychotic break. Of course, this is rare, but there is marijuana-induced psychosis that can occur, right? It can be associated with acute anxiety. It can be associated with panic attacks and panic reactions, like physical sensations in the chest and the throat. And it can produce temporary psychotic-like symptoms, okay? Again, temporary psychosis-induced marijuana usage, okay? To achieve these, especially these last effects, you have to take high doses, way more than you would find in commercially available products and their suggested dosing, right? So if you grab a pack of gummies for that are 10 gummies each, 10 milligrams. 10 milligrams is a suggested dose, or a dose that of a known quantity, especially. And for some people, 10 milligrams is too much. For some others, it's not enough, right? I'm talking like taking the entire pack at a time, right? Ingesting 100 milligrams at a time. That's going to create a situation of psychotic-like symptoms. And on top of that, the individual is important as well. Their biology and their physiology is important as well. So it's not just these high doses, but vulnerable people, right? But the film says that everything is inevitable, right? We see it with Bill. He immediately starts laughing, and that it's universal. Everyone does it. And that's simply not found in the literature. And of course, the addiction aspect of this, the tack that has been used since the 1980s, 1990s, even into the 2000s, that marijuana is a gateway drug, and it allows people to then use far more dangerous drugs like heroin, meth, or cocaine, or something like this, right? So it's not as bad as some drugs, but it opens the door for those other bad drugs. And it's addictive. You start as a teenager, and you're going to do it for the rest of your life, right? And because you'll build up a tolerance, and so you'll want more of it, and it will rule your life because you're going to do more and more and more. And if you have to stop, then you're going to have negative withdrawal symptoms, and that is in and of itself a conditioning situation to keep you addicted. But it is far, far less addictive than substances like alcohol and nicotine. It's also less physically dangerous than alcohol to both the brain and the body. Alcohol damages your liver over time. Marijuana doesn't do this at all. Nicotine, and especially the most common way of getting nicotine, is inhalation, damages your lungs. Well, the addiction indirectly damages your lungs, I suppose, right? Because the avenue is through tobacco products, and you get cancer in your mouth if you do chew. You can get lung cancer, all of this stuff. So it's really weird that the film decides to show it as enslaving. And I love how the TV movie musical plays up on this satire, right? They dial it up to 11. And it's important to note that the satire is important for that production when it was meant to be sincere for this production. And, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, not a super ton because of how THC has been scheduled for several decades now, since the 1970s, as a Schedule 1. There is no medical benefit to cannabis at all, especially THC. So we're going to make it hard to do research on. So there's not a lot of research when you compare it to nicotine or alcohol or something like that. But from the evidence that we do have, as Western medicine would argue, and even Eastern medicine as well, would suggest that it is not as dangerous physiologically, behaviorally, or psychologically as avenues for nicotine or avenues for alcohol. But it is feared to be because of how much of ingrained, racialized, and sensationalized cultural stories impacted its proliferation. And so in this last segment, I want to talk about how propaganda like this works, right? So fear is a powerful teaching tool. Okay? Propaganda works because of the mere exposure effect. The more you show someone how bad something is, the more that they will believe it, even if they're not paying attention, right? So why did Reefer Madness work for a good decade or so on the exploitation scene, as well as getting a Drug Control Act outlawing it and then scheduling it as a Schedule 1 narcotic in 1972? Why did it work? It's because the exaggeration. It was like, oh my God, clutching pearls kind of thing. Fear is a powerful short-term motivator for all sorts of things. It tells us what to do with our behavior in the short term. It does not help us in the long term. But when we make decisions as a nation, as a group of people, to respond to short-term needs, like let's make a law that has long-lasting impacts, we're using the fear to make that law in the short term and not thinking about the impacts in the long term, which is tough, right? Because you end up reducing the amount of exploration that we could have done. We could know about the substance now, the plant now, and how it is used, and what ways that we could use it. What are the socially acceptable ways? And lots of things have changed, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. But not only does it help us make decisions in the short term, it is a way of simplifying and making memorable associations. So it takes complex issues and simplifies them, and then allows us to create memorable associations. It's like speed, accuracy, trade-off. So fear makes us make a decision in the short term right now, but we trade off the accuracy of our calculus, of our thinking of this thing that is fear, that is causing the fear.
Jimmy? Mary told me to wait and tell her she had to go home. Her mother wanted her to go to the dressmaker with her.
Oh, thanks, Jimmy. Must be getting grown up. I see Mary let you have the car.
Yeah. Did I take you any place?
Well, I wasn't going any place in particular.
Well, then, how about driving me over to the show place with me? I'll buy you a soda.
I never drink that stuff.
Well, gee, I'll buy you something else.
Okay. You're on the hook for one root beer.
Well. Hi, Bill. Hi, Jimmy. Hey, Jimmy.
Hello, Jimmy. Hello, Bill. Come on, slide in.
Hello, Lance.
Hello, Ralph. How are you? Hello, Ralph. How have you been, Ralph? Hello, Bill. 2 sodas. No, I need 1 soda and 1 root beer. How's Meg?
Oh, she's fine. We're going up to her apartment a little later.
Couldn't Bill come along?
Mm-hmm.
Well, come on along. Bill, you'll get a kick out of it.
Thanks just the same.
Oh, come on, Bill. Mary won't be jealous.
Why, sure. All the kids will be there. It's keen.
Well, I don't know. I really shouldn't. Well, okay.
Hi, kid. Hello, Jack. What do you say? Yeah, come on in.
Come on, Bill. Don't stand there.
Well, if you say so, it's all right with me. I'll be glad to have met you. Hi, Mr. Kid. How you doing? There's a new one in the bay.
Yeah, Bill Hawker. He's all right. Blanche's got herself about a yen for her.
Not bad. I didn't think you had that much taste.
She knows what she's doing. She's got Ralph nuts about her, and now she's got her hooked up with this new kid.
Say, we haven't any more smoke. You better run over and get some.
Why couldn't you find that out when I was here this morning? Now I've got my car in the shop.
Well, what of it? That kid out there, Jimmy, he's got a car. He'll take you. Come on, get going. Hurry up.
Hey, Jimmy. Yeah? I've got to run over to Cedar Avenue for a minute. You've got a car, haven't you? Why, yeah, my sister. Mind giving me a lift? Why, sure. Come on. Okay.
Because I love me some cognitive biases. Another thing that I wanted to mention about how this movie works is the availability heuristic. In the 1930s, this was at the top of everyone's mind. And when things are at the top of your mind, they're more easily remembered. And if you repeatedly go, weed, insanity, murder, weed, insanity, murder, weed, insanity, murder, then it feels more real. You're like, weed? I shouldn't do that. I'm going to be murderous. I'm going to be an insane murderer. Nah, of course, that's not actually true, right? Do more car accidents happen, or do more deaths by terrorism happen in a given year? Well, it's obviously more car accidents, but terrorism is sensational. That's newsworthy. Car accidents aren't always newsworthy, and yet they do happen, and people do die. But when you go weed, insanity, murder for an hour, people are like, wow, that marijuana thing, man, shoot. And then word of mouth, and it spreads, and it becomes available in everyone's minds. And they think it's more likely. They're like, ooh, them kids are using that marijuana cigarettes. There's this film called Beyond the Valley of the Dolls that has a scene that Sublime used to introduce their Smoke Two Joints song, right? And I can recite it because I love that song. But it goes to show that even in this movie that came out in 1970 would say something like, there were 4 individuals. She was living in a single room with 300 individuals. One of them was a male, and the other two were females. God only knows what they were up to in there. And furthermore, Susan, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to learn that all 4 of them habitually smoked marijuana cigarettes. Reefers. Yeah, exactly. Even if it's false. Availability heuristic. I love it. And then I think the last part of this, psychologically, that works in this movie, which is, this is why the propaganda works, is that it preys upon this anxiety that was occurring in the 1930s. Yes, the United States government was trying to do things to alleviate the Great Depression, but let's be real, it was almost a decade long of people who were like having significant problems. And the ruling class, that is the adults, quote unquote, in the room, people who were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, they were born before the turn of the 20th century. And so the wounds of the Civil War were still very real. There was still so much racism in this country, a failed Reconstruction because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and then just the ineffectual Johnson era Reconstruction that, was still hampered with Grant as president. Like, these people were suffering, and they not only were afraid of this new century and youth rebellion in between what would become the 2 world wars, right? The First World War was pretty tough, even on Americans who only spent a little more than a year in the war. But the newfound movements of the Roaring '20s and sexual promiscuity and other sorts of youth rebellion, right? And then they were also afraid of like losing control. This generation is referred to as the generation of the children that they were having, is I think referred to as the silent generation, because of how they were sandwiched in between the 2 world wars. I don't know what the generation is called before the silent generation that I'm referring to here, but they were afraid that like the prosperousness of the 20s that led to the disaster of the 30s would lose them control. And how do you maintain control? You take away things that the youth like. You take away things. So the first thing that the other folks were doing that they took away was alcohol. Well, that didn't work. Well, now what do we take away? Well, we take away this new thing that they like, that's getting them through these tough times. Well, let's make it cannabis and marijuana. It becomes a stand-in for all these anxieties, right? And then they use authority to help with the messaging. They bring in doctors, they bring in educators, they bring in police officers, they bring in all sorts of people who can say something about marijuana or about cannabis that may or may not be true, but it's said with the credentials, it's said with the degree, and it has a lot of backing. And so where do we go? Where have we come? Actually, luckily, over the last 90 years or so, we have made a lot of progress as a society. And I'm really only talking about the United States, but Canada and as part of North America is in there as well. Europe, in some ways. There are lots of places in the world that are still sort of, I think, behind in many ways about this product, as opposed to things like alcohol or tobacco products, which carry, nicotine, right? And so we have progressed in the last 90 years. I think over almost or something like 3/4 of the states in the United States either allow cannabis to be used medically or both medically and recreationally by adults 21 or older. And just recently, in the last couple of years, a bunch of states have been added to this. Now, there are a few states who are just like, nope, the whole thing's illegal. I think the problem exists that states are doing this on their own, but the federal government has not relented on its scheduling. Cannabis is still a Schedule, specifically THC, is still a Schedule 1 narcotic, and that doesn't make any sense. And it is hampering to a significant degree research, because the federal government is probably the best place to get these kinds of drugs in their purest forms so that research can be conducted across the country with using the same kinds of controls. But of course, we have different institutions doing different studies with different dosing amounts, with different strains, and it makes it difficult to cast a wide net. And I think a study just came out that suggested that while cannabis is not necessarily shown to be super therapeutic for a wide variety of medical disorders, whether they're psychological or physical, like things like glaucoma or something, CBD does have some promise, but it's difficult to do all of this research, right? So the goal here is, and the thing that I advocate for, is evidence-based research, right? Let's do the real work to find out whether or not cannabis is a boogeyman. Focus on the risks, right? Tell people that these are the things that could happen. These are the effects of the body that really do occur, and have nuanced conversations about how things are different. If alcohol is legal in this country, I see no reason why something like cannabis can't also be. If tobacco products are known to cause cancer in the mouth, the esophagus, the throat, or the lungs, as well as many other places, and cigarettes are still legal, then I see no reason why cannabis can't be either. Now, I won't say that as someone who says that it's not harmless. It, of course, is a psychoactive substance, and all psychoactive substances do something to our brains and should be regulated. And I think that the best way to regulate a substance is to tax that substance. Yes, I am for taxation of vice products that exist in the world. Regulate them, make them safe. You have to put the amount of alcohol on the bottle for every bottle sold. You have to tell people that 4%, 45%, etc. of this bottle is ethanol, and it will affect your brain. Like, you have to put the Surgeon General's warning label on a pack of cigarettes. This product causes birth defects. This product causes lung cancer. Like, you regulate that stuff, man. Let's do it. That way we can talk about cannabis not as this jingoistic racial boogeyman, but dosage and what that dosage will do to you. The context in which you're taking it. Are you taking cannabis to help you with anxiety? Are you taking cannabis in lieu of alcohol to ease your social anxiety or relax you after a long day of work, right? Context matters here, right? Talk about it as far as individual differences. pregnant people shouldn't do this because it can pass the placental barrier and impact the baby. It's, all of these things, right? And then focus on realistic risk and not like, oh, it's going to make you insane and make you murderous, because that is not at all what it does. So, let's all like be adults about it and not go like, oh my God, I'm going to kill us all. Why should we do all? It's a drug, man. You shouldn't do it. Now, meth, you should not do once. Don't do meth, right? Just maybe let's don't do meth. And maybe let's try not to do some opiates. And if you're going to do the opiates, make sure you have some Narcan with you, right? And do it with somebody else who's not doing it, right? Let's do it safe. Harm reduction is how we should be approaching human existence. Harm reduction. People are going to do these things. Let's make sure they do them safer. All right, so that's Reefer Madness, the 1936 or 38. It's 1938 on Wikipedia, so let's go with that. It's a fun one to laugh at. And like I said, watch the amazing 2005 TV movie musical. You'll enjoy it. It's the one that I watched a long time ago that got Reefer Madness in my head. Yeah, let's do it. Now, this episode is going out on 4/20. That's why I did Reefer Madness. You'll probably see the reason why when you see, oh, it's 4/20 and there's a new podcast episode. Yep, that's 100% it, right? So watch this one because it's so good to laugh at the cheesiness, the corniness, the poor production value, all of it. Like I said, it's like The Room. It's so bad. It's good, right? And it's a useful one to learn the history of the time period. It's like a snapshot in time, right? And so that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.